All right. Without further ado, David, are you on?
Yes, I am. I'm right
Do
here.
you have a reading or launching right into the
Well, I
portion?
do have a brief reading today, and this comes from Dante from La Vita Nuova, published in 1295. And they used it on a Star Trek, a Voyager, that really meant a lot to me. So that's my quote for today. In that book, which is my memory, on the first page, that is the chapter when I first met you, appear the words, "Here begins a new life."
Every day begins a new life.
Yes.
Each day, right. Today, each day.
Each day.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher tishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We thank you, God, for inviting us with the life-sanctifying mitzvah and to affirm the study of Torah. All right, with our Torah portions in Deuteronomy. David, Professor, we're going to let you go first.
Okay, thank you.
What verses? What chapters?
We're starting at Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 23. The portion is Vayet Hanan. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a summary of that portion. It's really quite an interesting one because it begins when Moses is actually, the Hebrews are all there.
Excuse me.
They are all there on the coast of the River Jordan, and they are ready to cross the river and go into the promised land. And Moses, as he's there, is really thinking, I really want to see that. I really want to go in there, even though I know that God punished me. He said that I'm not going to see that I'm not going to cross the river, but because for the reason that I struck the rock instead of actually speaking to it, because he told me to speak to it, and I was in a bad mood that day. And what I did, instead of speaking to it, I took my staff and I hit it, and God did not like that. Anyway, a little bit about that is that he really pushed. Moses really pushed and was begging God to let him cross the river and to go into Jordan, and he didn't. But God said, "No way, you are not going to cross the river. I meant what I said, and however, I will let you climb this mountain and look across, and you'll be able to see the land that your people will occupy." And this is something here. One of the things that I noticed is that the promised land was already occupied by people. And one of the things that it says in Deuteronomy in this portion is that God slew them and just got rid of them all so that the Jews could take it over. I'm not sure that that's really the best thing to do. This portion is divided.
That's kind of a loose translation, but right.
Okay. I mean, I'm sorry. It's kind of a loose and modern translation. And let me see where I'm going here. And it's divided. The portion is divided into 7 readings, or 7 aliyot. And in the first reading, Deuteronomy chapter 3, Moses is asking God to, and when God refuses, Moses accepts that. He exhorts the Israelites to heed the laws of God, not to add anything to them, and not to take anything away from them. And in the second reading, he continues that argument. He says, if you observe God's laws faithfully, then you're going to prove to other peoples that the Israelites are wise. It'll show their wisdom. And they're saying it's a very good thing to follow God's laws.
Okay, all right.
There's punishment if you don't.
Yeah, I'm gonna confirm, let me just confirm. I don't wanna move you twice if I don't have to, so let me just double check.
I apologize. I may have to move in the room because like I said, there's a baby naming going on and more people than expected showed up. So they have to come into a room where there's no divider between where I am. So I may have to move around. He's going to give me a high sign in a minute.
Okay.
But David, sorry for the interruption, but we'll see what happens.
Okay, we're back. Okay. Moses went on to say that God was angry with him and that God swore that Moses would not enter the land, but he would die instead in the land east of Jordan. And he cautions again not to forget the covenant that God has concluded.
All right. I'm going to disappear for a minute while we move farther down the hallway.
Yeah, I will continue. And Moses at this point summons heaven and earth to witness against the Israelites that should they make,
Carry that, I'll carry the rest.
and he then gets very specific. They're not to make any sculptured image like they did when God originally signed the covenant with them. And
It just surprised me.
and there we are.
Couples is here.
In the third reading, Moses sets aside 3 cities on the other side of the Jordan River.
I haven't had a feeling the beginning of this, the start.
Hey, Rabbi, you may want to mute when you're moving around like that. I shouldn't ask you to do that.
No, it should be open.
Okay, and in the fourth Aliyah, Moses again summoned the Israelites, and he called on them to hear the laws that were proclaiming that day at Sinai, and to study and observe them.
You want to sit right here?
Study and observe them faithfully. And now I guess we get to the heart of this particular portion, when they actually repeat the 10 Commandments, and this is where it's so important. So the 10 Commandments are being repeated, and this is where I really need to be reading this to you.
Yep.
First one is, of course, a statement, I am the Lord your God. And the second one says, you must not have no other gods beside me. You're not going to make yourself any image, any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters below the earth. And he specifically does not prohibit studying these things and to go up to to look up at the sky and study it, but he does not want you worshiping it. This is not what the Hebrews are supposed to be doing. The third commandment is, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. And the third commandment has had kind of a rough time with me, I must say, because as Wendy will attest, I do have a temper, and occasionally that temper gets lost, and I have been known to violate the third commandment, and I'm admitting it to you because I feel very bad about it. But it happens very quickly, like if I drop something or spill coffee or something, I know when he's going to be angry about it, or even if I don't, I get really very angry, and that's when this sort of things happens. One commandment I've never had a problem with is the next one: honor thy father and thy mother. Because I have to tell you that I miss them both so much right now. And then comes the set of commandments thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not covet. And so these are the things that are happening. In the sixth reading, Moses is continuing to impart God's instructions with the Shema. And in this part is where they start to say, where he actually repeats the Shema, which is really at the centerpiece of all of Judaism, these words. And so I'm going to recite them right now as we do in the congregation. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. A very simple statement. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And that has been open to interpretation over the centuries and millennia. And Rabbi Hertz, in my commentary, talks about it. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. But he really criticizes one of those interpretations. The Lord our God is one God. And he says that is utterly meaningless because that is not what the interpretation is. And here is the part that the rabbi criticized me at the beginning. In the seventh portion, the seventh Aliyah, God brought them to the land and dislodged. The word they use is dislodged. The Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The Israelites were the doomed to destruction, grant them no terms, give them no quarter. The Israelites were not to intermarry with them. And I agree with the rabbi that that is, especially in our modern age, subject to interpretation. And so we've had quite a trip here. But the idea that the commandments are repeated is a very important one because repetition is really a very central theme in Jewish scripture. And so at this point, we finish the portion and we go to the Haftorah, which I just wanted to add a very small amount to the Haftorah, which is from Isaiah, from the prophet Isaiah. And I'm quoting from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 20, verse 22. And they say, it is he that sitteth above the circle of the earth, and the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers, that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain, and spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in. And I'm going to end this by saying that whenever I go out under the night sky at night, I haven't had a chance lately because of the weather, but whenever there is a blessed clear night, I feel that way. I go out and I feel that the night sky is stretched over us as a curtain. And it's a beautiful, wonderful feeling. And on that note, Rabbi, I'm going to end this.
Thank you, David. Right. Okay. I'll just take advantage of the moment and to give a plug and promotion that because we had to postpone again the special discussion about the Ten Commandments. Ruth Ann, maybe you can remind me. August 30th, I think, is
August
the date.
30th.
August 30th, 10 o'clock. We'll finally get to add more commentary to the second set of commandments, the way David was talking about them. I'm not sure that we will conclude all 10, but we'll certainly continue with that process. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The task falls on me to summarize two more parshiot, two more of the portions, and then to focus on this week's portion, which is easy to do. I know it well, not just from my rabbinic study and teaching, but because it's memorable. It's my daughter's bat mitzvah portion. So spent a lot of one-on-one time talking about it. But meanwhile, we're back on Akev, which is Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 12, is where we begin. Akev obviously continues with this farewell address, this farewell sermon that Moses is giving to the people, as David was reminding us that Moses, standing on the top of the mountain overlooking the Jordan River, he knows that he will not be able to cross over the Jordan. In the portion that David was talking about, Moses was pleading with God, please, 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 one last chance. Let me at least set foot there. No, you can only see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over. So Moses goes back into, again, given a parallel, if you will, to some other conversations that many of us have had over the last month or 6 weeks. The next several chapters really constitute what we would call Moses's ethical will. And there have been a number of times that we've referred to that, of what we share not only in our financial resources or our assets to our progeny, to our children, grandchildren, and whatever. Moses is giving a repeat lesson of the central themes and the central values of how he interprets the Israelite religions, later to be called Judaism, if you will. In rabbinic tradition, this part of the Torah is where Moses is referred to as Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. This is where he's teaching, rather than being a leader, rather than military leader, or rather even than a prophet. So kind of keep that perspective in mind, or that context, that these next several portions, probably about 10 chapters worth, really become Moses's ethical will to the people. He tells them, God will keep the covenant. God promises to keep the covenant, but it's a two-way street. God will only fulfill his part of the breach, his part of the covenant, if Israel obeys the laws that have been given. And the rewards, or what God promises to us, to the people, is that the land on which we dwell will be fruitful. There will be, believe it or not, and I'm sure that this was the focus of quite a few sermons over the last several weeks, there will be no disease. I wonder why there is around the world, but the Israelites will be victorious over their enemies. But Moses continues, it's not just simply black and white. It's not just simply if and but. God will still be testing all of you with hardships. Some of you might remember the phrase that it usually gets taken out of context: man does not live by bread alone. All right. But we live, meaning we prosper, we're fruitful, we succeed based on God's desires, not just on what we accomplish by ourselves. It's in the partnership, it's in the contract and the covenant, if you will. Another lesson of the ethical will, that what I call the ethical will, is don't be too selfish, don't be too arrogant, don't think that you were able to accomplish all of this and occupying the land and inheriting the promised land. But it was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob who did that for you, or at the very least, with you. Hence, how do we affirm that every day or every meal traditionally? The Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, which is centered around the phrase Ve'achalta v'verachta v'savata, that when you eat, then you bless, and then you enjoy or appreciate the satiation, everything that you've been able to provide or have given as provision in your life. But just don't say that it's because of what you did. It's because of what God has done. Hence, every time that we acknowledge or we recognize the gifts, we say Birkat Hamazon, and we say Modim Anachnu Lach, and we say thank you, or the various iterations of that kind of a prayer. Moses puts himself into perspective. Again, in the context of this ethical will, he puts himself into perspective. He acknowledges that he was angry with the people when they created the golden calf at Mount Sinai. Here it's called Mount Horeb. But that he admits that he lost patience with them. But he didn't give up on them. He went back up to the top of the mountain and he pleaded with God not to annihilate all the people. However, the rabbis point out, it's not because Moses had faith in the people and their abilities to, forsake idolatry and whatever. When Moses appeals to God, he says, don't kill all the people, because all the other nations around us might say that God was powerless to bring the Israelites into the land, might say that God has no mercy for these people. And is that the kind of God that we want to start believing in also? So the rabbis question exactly what Moses's motivation was there, but he places himself in the very special role of pleading with God on their behalf. And he reminds the people, he says, as God reached out to you to save you, plagues in Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, giving the 10 Commandments, and then forgiving, in a sense, or at least moving on after the episode of the golden calf, so must you, the people, so must you uphold all those who are in need, all those who need to be redeemed, all those who are hungry, all those who are homeless. That's your way of emulating, that's our way, but that's what Moses is saying. That's your way of emulating God's grace and God's providence by taking care of God's creatures here on earth. So that's part one, or the first of the portions that comprise what I would call Moses's ethical will. The next is known as Re'eh, begins in chapter 11, verse 26 of Deuteronomy, and continues for about five chapters also. Here, like David, I'm going to go backwards for a minute. Like David was saying that Moses, his we call it the watchword. His credo is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. I'll pronounce it Sephardic style rather than the French Canadian Ashkenazi style that the Levites were using. But the Moses continues. It's that opening phrase. It's Shema Yisrael appears several times. Think of Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream. Okay, in that great speech that we remember. And Shema Yisrael is the repeat. Hero Israel, listen Israel. I'm telling you, I'm going to tell you to say it again and again and again. Shema Yisrael, this is not only Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, but these are the things that you need to do. These are the things that you need to avoid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in Re'eh, in this portion, Moses sets up or continues to set up and gives further description of the theme that is going to be present now for the next several weeks, not only in the Torah, but also in our lives, the month of Elul, as we prepare for the new year. So the phrase will sound familiar. Re'eh natati lifnechem hayom. Here I place before you this day, blessing and curse, good and evil, life and death, uvacharta v'chaim, choose life. We talked about it at services on Friday night, that there are some rabbis who emphasize the word hayom, that each day, this day, hayom, today, that is the most important, because on each day we have to make those choices. On each day we have to make those decisions between blessing and curse, between good and evil, between life and death, as well as the fact that Moses' speech to the people at that point, he jumps into the grammatical, the singular. It's I give this to you individually. In Hebrew, there's a difference between the you singular and you plural. So it's you, this is your choice, each individual, each person on each day, hayom, on this particular day. He refers also, again, we talked about it on Friday night, he refers also to this ceremony, again, emphasizing the difference between the blessing and the curses, that some of the tribes would stand on one mountain, some of the tribes would stand on the other, as a way of reminding each and calling to the other and saying, we reject the curses, or we accept the blessings, and whatever. That's a ceremony that will appear several times in the Torah. In the portion of Re'eh, there's also, and this may not be something that resonates with all of us, but certainly for centuries, if not millennia, it was something that resonated with the Jewish people, and that's what the laws of kashrut and what's called shechita. You might know the Yiddish word a shoichet. A shoichet is the ritual slaughterer, talking about how not only each the animal that is to be eaten, but how to slaughter and how to prepare the particular kind of meat. That's linked together with the admonition of don't be lured into idolatry and don't follow the false prophets. Now, false prophets in this particular case, as opposed to what we were talking about a little bit on, I don't think it was last Saturday morning, I wasn't with you, but the Saturday before, we were talking about how to tell the difference between a false prophet and a true prophet. I forget exactly who asked the question, but in this particular Torah portion, there's a very specific reference. Moses is talking to, believe it or not, he's talking to you that if the false prophecy comes from a member of your family or someone with whom you are very close, a very, very close friend. Okay? And if the purpose of their prophecy, if the purpose of the message that they are trying to bring is to lure you away from belief in the Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, the one God, if that's the purpose, then you know that, or that's the motivation of this family member or of a close friend, then you know that he or she is a false prophet, and you reject that entirely. This portion does not address other kinds of prophecy, only if it's a family member or someone with whom you're close who's trying to lure you away from the faith of Israel. There's discussion of the sabbatical, the Jubilee year, I'm sorry, it's the sabbatical, the Shabbaton, as well as the Yovel, the Jubilee year, and also what's called the Shemitah year. Now, Shemitah year is the 50th year also for the land to lay fallow, and also one of the results of the sabbatical year on a smaller scale, but the Shemitah year, the Jubilee year, on a larger sense, is the canceling of all debts. And this leads into a lot of discussion in the Talmud, especially on, well, wait a minute. If I'm a banker, okay, if I'm a banker, am I going to, I'm looking at Ruth Ann on my screen here because she's got the banking experience, right? Okay. If I'm a banker, am I going to give someone a loan knowing that in 2 years, let's say, that the debt's going to be canceled? Okay. So, the likelihood is but what about the individual who needs that loan for their employment, for their occupation, for their family, to buy a house, to provide shelter, whatever it might be? And so you're kind of torn between the idea of canceling all debts and everyone has the chance to start again on an equal level, or people who are entitled to profit, to make money, without necessarily exploiting someone else. And there's this tension. It takes pages and pages and pages in the Talmud. And along comes a rabbi whose name you may know, and that's Rabbi Hillel. You've heard of Hillel the elder, actually, who issues what's called a prose bull. A prose bull is like the one man says, everybody agrees, everybody acknowledges his authenticity, and boom, what he says is going to go. Whether or not he's been inspired by God, whether it's just a simple compromise, whatever. There are a few different ways that Jewish law can be adjudicated by only one individual, and a prose bull is one of them. Another one we've talked about it is called teku. That's when Elijah will come and tell us what the answer should be. And then the third is called the bat kol, which is a voice from God, comes down and interrupts. And there are several stories in rabbinic literature of how the rabbis are arguing, or the judges are arguing, should it be this way, this one's innocent, this one's guilty, whatever. And then a bat kol comes, a voice from God comes down and says, no, this is the answer, this is what's right. So prose bull is developed out of this notion, or this tension of, well, if all debts are going to be canceled, how do we make sure that those who need the loan or need some kind of a business deal will still be able to get it? The portion also talks about tithing, about 10% of your profit or 10% of your produce that goes to the Kohanim and the Levim, to the priests and the Levites. Talks about the treatment of slaves. Yes, there were Hebrew slaves, obviously. As a matter of fact, in the Jubilee year, all slavery is canceled. All slaves go free. But what about, they must have incurred this situation. What about someone who says, I want to remain a slave? For whatever reason, I want to remain indentured to my master. So there's a particular strange ceremony where the owner or the master of the slave can kind of poke a hole in the ear with an awl, A-W-L, with an awl, and that's a symbol to anyone whom this Israelite might encounter, that he, or again she, has chosen to remain as an indentured slave for one reason or another. The final comment with the portion of Ra'eh deals with a concept that we could certainly spend a lot of time about in discussion. We won't today, but it's certainly a topic for another time, and of which there have been volumes written in Jewish philosophy over the centuries. And that is that Moses reminds the people that they are an am segula in Hebrew, which we would translate as a treasured people, or a people who are a treasure. We usually use the phrase the chosen people today. And most of the more recent literature is, are we the chosen people? Are we choosing? Are we people who choose? Are we chosen for good? Are we chosen for the pain and suffering that we've had to endure as a people? Is the title or the honorific of being an am segula, a treasured people, is that something that's automatic? or is that something that we must earn each day? We may have talked about that back in Leviticus chapter 19, the holiness code, you shall be holy for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Does that mean that we are all holy automatically, or that we have to, through our lives, our decisions, our actions, that we have to prove that we are holy in our lives? But Moses's theme in here is that it's not chauvinism. It's not you're treasured people and that you're better, that you whatever, just because you may have a treasured piece of jewelry doesn't mean that you're not allowed to have other jewelry that also might be still very, it still might be very valuable, but you're entitled to have one piece for whatever reason. It's the most expensive, it's the oldest, it's the one that your mother or your mother-in-law wore, and so there's nostalgia attached to it. There's no definition in Moses's mind of how to earn that honorific of being treasured, but a recognition that the Israelites can be the treasured people without feeling superior to the others. We're chosen for a particular purpose, and Moses seems to say that it's a recognition of our, I guess today we would say a skill or talent, our abilities, recognizing that we don't always use all of our abilities, all of our skills, all of our talents in the correct way or in the way that we should. So that seems to be Moses's message there. Okay. Let me pause for a minute so I can take a little sip of my drink here. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, David, please.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments. One is about the chosen people, which is obviously a central segment of what you were trying to say with this portion. And of course, that reminds me of that very famous line from Fiddler on the Roof: "For once, God, could you please choose somebody else?"
Mhm.
But the other little point has to do with, near the beginning of your commentary, you had mentioned that God had promised that there would be no disease in the promised land, which reminds me of a very
that would be a reward if, that's part of the covenant. If it's not automatic. It's if the children of Israel obey God's laws.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that reminds me of a very beautiful story that I wish to share with you. There was, and I know I've told this to Wendy several times, but I'll say it again, but there was a young man who was in the concentration camps. I believe he lost at least one of his parents in the concentration camps. After the Second World War, he was able to get out, and he was able eventually to get out of Europe and take a ship to the United States. And he went to college. He had a very interesting career in pharmacology, and he joined he eventually joined one of the major pharmaceutical industries, Pfizer. He, in fact, eventually, over the years, became the chief executive officer of Pfizer. And what happened is that Pfizer, as you know, last fall, was the first company to come out with the vaccine for the pandemic that we have, and which a lot of us have taken. Anyway, what isn't so much known is that this wonderful man grabbed a sufficient portion of the vaccine, the very first ones, and he sent them to Israel as thanks. Sent a whole bunch to Israel before giving them even to his fellow Americans. And I just wanted to share that wonderful, wonderful story with you right now. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Sure, Gail. You're muted, Gail. You're muted.
I don't want to lead us astray in a whole area, and you may want to address this at another time, but I've always thought what struck me most about Deuteronomy as a whole is that it seems as if Moses is addressing adults, not children. And the message seems to be, okay, here's the rules. The onus is on you. Okay. No one's going to come down and do something miraculous. It's a very mature book compared, I think, to the other ones. I mean, that's the way it strikes me. I don't know if you want to even go
Well,
there.
as most scholars would certainly agree that it's not only a different author, but it's written in several generations later.
Right.
Okay? With that recognition. So it's more than just stylistic. But going back to, David was telling us about the Shema, but he was primarily referring to the one sentence that's so familiar to all of us. In Jewish literature, when we talk about the Shema, that includes all the paragraphs between saying Shema Yisrael and Mi Chamocha. Okay. And so the central theme of that what they call the rubric in the liturgy, the central theme is not just Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. It's also Vishinantam Livanecha. It's also teach your children.
Right.
Before Crosby, Stills, and Nash. All right, but it's teach your children. Lama'an tiskaruva asita. You got to remind everyone to do these things. It doesn't come naturally.
Right. Exactly.
This is something that you have to make the choice to do. Right. And again, those of us with children and grandchildren say it's amazing how sometimes it's just instinctive for them to do the right thing. But our literature is filled with times when we chose to do the wrong thing. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we move on. Shoftim begins in I guess it's chapter 16, verse 18. Okay, is the beginning of Shoftim, a very, very rich portion, and this is where there's kind of a segue from what I was calling before Moses's ethical will, specifically to, let's say, his, and I don't mean biologically, but his children and those who are going to come after him. Now Shoftim begins a visualization. He's trying to describe what society, and it's not just Israelite society, it's what society and humanity should look like, and how to structure that, and how to inherit that, and how to make it meaningful and part of the covenant, if you will. As I said, this was our daughter Karen's bat mitzvah portion. I won't say how many years ago, because then you can figure out. Her birthday is, she was born on Rosh Hashanah, actually. The famous phrase, I'm sure all of you have heard it, is tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice shall you pursue. Which is interpreted in many, many different ways. It's one of the, in addition to the Shema and whatever, it's one of those code phrases that you'll find in almost every synagogue in one place or another. It might be over the ark. It might be the entrance to the religious school building, whatever. But almost everybody knows that phrase. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue, or justice shall be pursued justly, however you want to work with it. And Moses begins with this description of what the judicial process might look like, or he's instructing them. Again, he's the Moshe Rabbeinu, he's our teacher. This is what he's hoping for, or he's suggesting. And the difference, however, seems to be that he's not quoting God anymore. Okay, this is the Moses teaching. This is the old man, the one who's experienced all these things, the one who everybody has come to with their arguments, with their concerns, with their complaints, and here's how he's proposing, out of the wisdom of his ages, that their society can look like. If he's reconciled to the fact that he's not going to be there to help lead them, here are some of the things that he suggests shall be done. First, they need to appoint judges and officials, and the one of the key words seems to be like this notion of appointing, or that you should provide for yourself. And again, that provide for yourself phrase is in the singular. Okay, it's not just that all the people have to say, okay, you and you're going to be judges. It's the understanding is that there will be judges, there will be magistrates, whatever term you want to use, legal officials, but you need to be able to put your individual trust in them. It's not just that they will be appointed by others, you have to affirm your trust in them. He gives a number of examples of things, basic statements or rudimentary principles of jurisprudence that his assumption, and certainly the rabbis in their tradition, will continue on by expanding from these principles on to the larger society. So they talk about capital cases, a death penalty case. It's not just theoretical; they must have encountered it, and they made the decision that in a capital case there must be two witnesses testifying. We obviously understand them to be objective witnesses, impartial witnesses. We've already been told that judges and witnesses have to look for impartiality, but there need to be two witnesses. You can't convict someone and assign them the death penalty based on only one witness. There's a system of appeals. That you have the right to appeal, and that if a judge finds a case too difficult or too baffling, that there's a hierarchy of the judicial system, either with people of more age, or people of more experience, or people of more background, or people of more respect, who would be able to step in and provide assistance or backup to an individual judge. They then get in. Moses then gets into an interesting topic for the people in the regulations for choosing a king. Now, this is a controversial subject, okay? Because in some places, and we'll come back to this, I want to spend a little more time on it, but in some cases and places in the literature, in the Mikra, in the Bible, the Tanakh, there are some places where the people say, we want to have a king. There are some places where God says, I will provide a king for you. But how they get reconciled is an interesting thing, and that's what we'll talk about in a few minutes. But some of the regulations about how to choose the king and what the king They never talk about the queen. I'm sorry, not until Esther. But what the qualifications might be about the king. And again, this isn't because of the timing of when this was written. This is not talking about the line, the Davidic line, the line of David that will lead to the Messiah. That's a different experience entirely. So they bring up the subject of having a king. Moses reminds the people that they are responsible for providing for the Kohanim and the Leviim, for the priests and the Levites, because they do not have a portion of land. Therefore, all the people must contribute to providing for them. He once again reminds them about the lure of false prophets. And then there's this concept of the cities of refuge, what we would call today sanctuary cities, where someone who either was falsely accused and blood avengers are coming after him or her, or if someone was guilty of unintentional manslaughter, but the avengers are coming after him or her. There's a series of 7 cities of refuge that were identified throughout the tribes and throughout the territories, where someone who was fleeing could flee and would be entitled to be provided for and would find safety and sanctuary, again in our term, until, and how do we know how long it was? Until the death of the high priest. That was like, it didn't follow the Shemitah or the Yovel. It didn't follow the Jubilee years. It followed the life or death of the high priest. I remember having a conversation with some people where we noticed that and it's interesting that there would always the assumption is that there would always be people, and there would be the individuals in the people who were praying for the death of the high priest, so that they would be released from their sanctuary, if you will. But not only are the children of Israel reminded of this, the availability of these cities of refuge, but he went one step further, and he said, and you may not take down any of the landmarks, any of the signposts that would show people how to get to the cities of refuge. Because maybe, we have to go to to Tucson, or we have to go to Bisbee. How do we get there? I've never been there before. How do we get there? And so they could have confidence that the landmarks would still direct them on the correct route. He goes recognizing that the people are going to have to go to war. He gives regulations for the different types of war. There's battle that is commanded by God, or holy war, if you will. There's self-defense, if you are attacked. There's a war strictly for moral purposes, but never in Jewish tradition, at least in Moses's interpretation of Israelite tradition, never is there war only for the sake of self-aggrandizement, only for the sake of increasing your land, whatever. You can only follow God's command to do that. He follows up with it with a list of who's exempt from military service. Again, not to get into a controversial discussion of what happens in modern Israel today with the ultra-Orthodox who refuse to participate in military service. But there's a list, and it's a very interesting list. And because back to Gail's comment before, this is recognizing that there's a certain maturity in the development of the society, and a recognition of the role that each individual, certainly we're talking about the men here, but that each individual man might have towards his own family, his own future. So, for example, someone who has, they describe it as someone who has paid the bride price, someone who's participated in a negotiation with another family to take a bride, but the wedding ceremony hasn't taken place yet, is exempt from going to war. Doesn't mean that he can't volunteer, but he's exempted from. Someone who has announced plans to build a house, to build a new shelter for his family, is exempted from going to war, going to battle, until the house is completed. Someone who has planted the seeds for a new garden or orchard or whatever, or vineyard, but there's been no growth yet, is exempted from going to war until there's an identifiable product, however you want to say, coming out of his labor. Then there's also rules of war or battle from the other side. Don't cut down the trees unless it's a matter of military strategy. Don't cut down the trees from your enemy's neighborhoods or whatever. Don't redirect the streams of water who might bring sustenance to your enemy. And don't destroy anything that might have, on the one hand, might have benefit for you if you are occupying or inhabiting that particular territory, or don't destroy that which technically is part of God's creation. It's long before the psalmist said the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, but it's the same kind of theme. And they also then expand upon that into a concept, again, some of you might know the phrase Bal Tashchit. Bal Tashchit is needless, wasteful destruction or excessive cruelty, especially to animals, but it's also destruction of the environment, destruction of the forest, destruction of the water sources, things like that. So they develop that as an overriding principle of Jewish life, coming out of a discussion specifically in Moses preparing the people for the warfare and the battles of occupation. And again, there's room for discussion and controversy in applying some of that to contemporary Israel as well. Okay, I want to go back to, if we have time, at least one, if not two areas. Those of you who have been on this journey throughout the Torah with me, what I like to do is go back to some of the teaching and interpretation of a woman who was the professor of Bible at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Nechama Leibovich. And she has a great series of volumes that are actually based on her college lectures. It was a requirement for any American student, not just American, any diaspora student who was going to be studying at the Hebrew University, a junior year abroad, or your entire bachelor's degree, or in our case, rabbinic school. It was a mandatory course of an introduction to biblical commentary that Nechama taught. She taught it in Hebrew, but the notes and her lectures were all available, transcribed into English. And because of her erudition and the graduate students that worked with her, you could write your exams, you could write your final exam, there may have been a term paper along with it. I don't remember right now. It's a few years ago. You could write it in any language, whatever language you want. It didn't have to be in Hebrew. You could write it in English, you could write it in German, you could write it in Russian, you could write it in Arabic, whatever language, and the university would provide someone to translate it for her if she didn't know that language. Anyway, Nechama focuses, one of her lectures was focusing on, it's Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 and 15. That's the one about the king. And let me see if I can find it officially. Okay, so 14 and 15 in chapter 17. If after you have entered the land that the Lord your God has assigned to you and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. Be sure to set a king over yourself, one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kinsman. Okay. And then further on, you can't have many horses. That was obviously overlooked with Solomon and some things like that. But the question is, who decide? Do the people get to choose the king, or does God choose the king? Is it you may choose a king? You must choose a king? God might choose a king for you? God will choose a king for you? How exactly do we understand it? And also, is it okay for the Israelites in this case to be like other nations? All of Moses's themes so far have been, don't do what the other nations do. Don't fall into their patterns of worship or their patterns of sexual behavior or whatever it might be. Now, all of a sudden, is God saying, yeah, it's okay if you want to have a king like the others do. According to the Tosefta, now some of you may not know, Tosefta is a collection of laws and practices that did not make it into the Mishnah. Okay? The Mishnah is what's going to lead into the Gemara, which leads into the Talmud, etc. But in order for something to be in the Mishnah, it has to be based on a proof text from the Torah. Tosefta are laws or practices that come from the same time period, 2,100, 2,300 years ago, the same time period, but for one reason or another, and it might be because they didn't necessarily see the validity of the proof text coming from the Torah. So it's in a collection, but it's secondary to Mishnah. But it's still referred to a lot in rabbinic literature. Okay, so according to Tosefta, Israel is commanded to implement 3 mitzvot, 3 of the commandments, upon inheriting upon entering the land and occupying the land and claiming possession of the promised land. Okay, and we can guess what the first one is. The first one is to build the temple, to build a sanctuary. Okay, which David and then Solomon wind up doing. Okay, the second, and we only remember this once a year on Purim, is to cut off or totally extinguish any memory of Amalek. Okay, Amalek, who attacked the Israelites on their way and attacked them from behind, and the women and the children, and then Haman, remember him, Haman, who's a descendant of Amalek and whatever. So upon entering the land, where we have a land of our own, we're supposed to cut off all the seed of Amalek, cut off all of his descendants, cut off all memory of Amalek. Lo tishkach, don't forget. So we're reminded every year of who the guy was and what the story is, and then don't forget to. So that's why some people, well, certainly why we have Gregors and we drown out Haman's name, but other people write Haman or Amalek, whatever, on the bottom of their shoes and on Purim, and they stomp it out and wipe their feet, etc., 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 because that's mitzvah commandment number 2 when we enter the land, according to the Tosefta. Now, this is not according to, I mean, it's certainly part of mainstream normative rabbinic literature, but it's not, it's like the B sources as opposed to the A sources, or I'd say the Bet sources rather than the Aleph sources, right? Okay. And the third, according to the Tosefta, is that it's a mitzvah to appoint a king for themselves. So again, this is not necessarily the A source, this is the B source that includes it as one of the mitzvot, one of the commandments that once settled in the promised land, the children of Israel are to appoint a king for themselves, not God has one to appoint for them. Okay, so if you know the story, a few generations later, there's the prophet Saul. The people come to Saul and say, give us a king. And Saul at first says, no, God's the one, because he looks back at this text and he says, in the beginning, in the first part of chapter 17, whatever it says, and when you've occupied the land, I will choose a king for you. God says that. All right. So Saul says, no, it's premature. We're not totally settled in the land yet. We haven't developed ourselves as a true society. And he doesn't say this, but later interpretations state it, or commentators. What Saul is saying is, don't do this on my watch. Okay, wait till I'm gone. Then for whatever reason, either because he was power hungry himself, he liked being in charge himself, he didn't want someone that he had to give deference to, or because he just didn't want to get involved in what he knew was going to be an extremely controversial situation. The elders of the people, this is all according to the Tosefta and the way that they describe what was going on. The elders of the people, the leaders, said, we need to have a king to fill the role of what Moses had told us there should be as a judge. Okay, but the people, Amcha, the citizenship, says, no. We need to have a king so that we can claim legitimacy as a nation. Every nation around us has a king. Okay, and everyone pays obeisance to the king. If we want to be treated like other nations and considered legitimate, we need to have a king also, not a prophet, not a priest. We need to have a king. That's the way of the world. And so, which is it that God will determine when it's time, that the people say we're ready for a king? Saul says, wait a minute, for whatever his motivation is, wait a minute, don't do this yet. And then in the commentaries, and Nechama Leibovich goes into a lot of detail about this, she says that the best explanation to resolve the debate is provided by Isaac Abravanel, a Spanish commentator and rabbi. He says that God commanded the following, and I'm giving you almost the exact quote: you may not elect a king as you want, but I will appoint one. Okay? In other words, God permits the people to have a king, but it's not an absolute command, that because God says you may have a king, not you must have a king, not I give you a king, but this is how we're going to do it. Okay, in due time, the opportunity will come along for us to have a king. And so it kind of gets Saul off the hook. The people are satisfied; they will get one. It may not be immediately, it may not be according to their timetable, but it is going to happen. So that's, Nechama has a whole. Again, I'm trying to summarize completely. The other, I'll just take 2 minutes to do another one that I happen to like a lot. She did a lecture about what we were talking about in the different categories and different regulations for warfare. about protecting the trees, because if you protect the trees, you're protecting man, you're protecting God's creatures. That's based on chapter 20, verses 19 and 20. It just started pouring here, as a matter. I don't know. Have you gotten rain down there again?
Not
Okay.
right now.
No,
We got some last night, Rabbi.
Did you? Okay. Yeah, we had it last night, and now there's another storm right now too. Okay. So there's a midrash that is a tree. Can you compare a tree to a human being? Rashi and Ibn Ezra and some of the others get involved because there's the Hebrew word ki, which some of you know might mean because, or might mean if, or when. But Rashi says it's like, really? It really is a tree like a human being kind of thing. And Ibn Ezra answers and says that a tree is like a human being because trees are necessary for human beings to live. If you don't have trees, then and they don't mean just the mesquite trees or the poplar trees or the oak trees or whatever. They mean all of God's the natural creation that we cannot. Back to that phrase of man cannot live on bread alone. It's on what God provides. So is the motive is compassion for all of God's creatures? Is that the motivation for protecting the trees, or is it a consideration of human need? Is it both, recognizing that all the earth and all it contains are God's? And the rabbinic tradition kind of steps in and says, no, really it's both. It's both. We protect the trees, we protect the environment, we watch out for the environment that's been given to us from the days of first creation, Adam and Eve, to protect it. And we do it because not only that's part of the divine imperative for us to be like God and be compassionate towards everything that surrounds us and try to live in peace and harmony with everything surrounds us, but for our own needs. If we don't protect them, and certainly there's a lesson for today, that if we don't take care of the environment, it will be to our own detriment as well. I had one other thought, and it just went right through my head. It may come back to me while I pause. So, okay. Any questions with any of this?
all I can think of, I think that I shall never see a palm as a tree, etc., etc.
Right. Okay. So the one question, I don't know, Ruth Ann, if you want to get involved in it or make a unilateral executive decision, is should we try to meet in September, or you think people will be, I know I'm a little busy, but will people be a little too occupied to meet again, and should we hold off until October? What do you think? It would be September.
It would be,
Is it September 11th, maybe? Is it 9/11?
no, it'd be September 13th.
13th, okay.
Hello.
I really don't care.
Anyone have any input one way or the other?
I am very happy one way or the other.
Yeah, I think we
Whichever
should.
way.
Sure,
If we'd offer it and see, and whoever,
right.
I think.
run it up
yeah,
the
that'd be
flagpole
good.
and see who salutes.
Yeah.
Grace, were you saying something? I'm sorry.
Yes, I think it's a good idea. I'd like to, be a part of that.
Okay, all right, then we will try and do our best. It's actually, if we follow the same pattern, the next time we would meet, oh yeah, there's my note. It's the 13th. It is the 13th. There'd actually be 5 portions, but 2 of them are extremely brief. So that's the way we would do it. Okay. Any other announcements for
No,
people to share?
quiet week this week. The the lecture on Wednesday's been postponed a week,
Uh-huh.
so it'll be now the 18th. And I can't remember. I'm having my senior moment right now. I
Untitled.
can't remember his name, but yeah, it should have been on the 11th. It'll be on the
David
18th.
Liebling. David Liebling.
Thank you. And otherwise, there's nothing going on this week.
Okay, well, I hope that for everybody down there, I hope that it's a good week. Safe, not too hot, the storm's not too bad.